I figured I'll try to do a bit of a story arc here since I've got a full hour. And I actually just wrote a lot about my background because I think for those people that are still in high school and still interested in kind of learning how you get to be an engineer for a medical device company, it's really important to know what drives people to do that and how they got there. So a lot of the slides are actually just my history and how I got to be where I'm at, and kind of the obstacles that I faced along the way, and hopefully you guys can take away some things from that. And then I'll focus at the end more just a discussion on what it is that I do every day, day in and day out. So a little bit about myself and where I came from and started. So I'm actually from the northern suburb of Chicago, Illinois, which is in the Midwest. When I was in high school, I really wasn't necessarily an academic focused person. I was more, of an athlete, someone that got pretty average grades. My parents were not engineers by any means, so both of them are social workers and therapists. So the apple kind of fell far from the tree in terms of where I'm at now in my life. And just overall a pretty average student. And I thought this was an interesting thing to share, and it just really has stuck with me. I think, for me, now I'm 28, turning 29. So graduating high school over 10 years ago, my math teacher actually told me, every student had to put up their intended major as they were going into their bachelor's degree. And I put mechanical engineering. And my math teacher came up to me and she was very concerned, and she said, Eric, I saw that you were trying to become a mechanical engineer. I think you might want to consider changing something to something with a little bit less math. So I wasn't in AP math. I wasn't a stellar math student. And I just said to her, I appreciate your concern, but I think I'm gonna try my hand at it. And it's just, I'll circle back to this point, but it's important that you don't let what other people say stand in your way, particularly when you have a passion to do something that you're interested in, because it can pay dividends in the long run. So from there, I actually, because I was from the Midwest, I was interested in a lot of schools in the Midwest, and ended up going to a school called University of Dayton, which is in Dayton, Ohio. They have a pretty strong aviation program as well as a mechanical engineering program. And from there, I entered as a general engineering student. So there was no possibility to actually go straight into mechanical engineering, but I did have an opportunity to take the general classes and, kind of got my feet wet there. And then eventually moved into the mechanical engineering track. And I actually was focusing on getting an MBA. So I wasn't interested in biomedical engineering at that point. I just knew that, I liked the aspects of mechanical engineering, and I thought maybe I could actually pursue more of a business aspect. And I would be lying to say that I wasn't interested, to see where business could take me, and, in the monetary aspect, and perhaps, career growth in that regard. And then something really interesting happened as I was pursuing my opportunities through the 5-year MBA program. And something really dramatic happened to me that actually caused me to shift into the BME track and where I am today. So I was actually working as a co-op in the business program for GE Aviation in their supply chain group. And this crazy thing happened to me as I was in college. Had 3 days of stomach pains and actually couldn't eat or sleep for 3 days. And so I had emergency surgery where they discovered that I had this very crazy anatomical issue called an intussusception. And that's really what pivoted my entire life into where I'm at today, and my focus really on helping people and improve human lives. And so for the 4 days that I was there, due to this condition, I just couldn't help but think that I wanted to repurpose what I was doing with my life and really retool the skills that I had in mechanical engineering. And I think there's a lot of people that you'll come across, not necessarily with this drastic of a story, but people in the BME discipline are very interested in a common goal, and that is really helping people and improving, the human condition. Okay, I'll speed through some of this, but next chapters, basically, like I said, that was a huge shift in my mentality. And you know, as you guys are probably a little bit younger, you don't necessarily have that, you know, light bulb moment or that thing that helps to propel you in the direction, but at least you're already thinking about, you know, what you can do as a person to improve the lives of other people and the well-being and the health of other people. So after that, I dropped the MBA, focused really heavily on BME. I got an internship with Johnson & Johnson as a co-op, and then started looking at master's programs. And I will say, you know, something that's been interesting coming from the Midwest and that I would advocate for all of you guys going into college is do take opportunities for internships, co-ops, and anything else that you can really do to get working experience, because it really does give you a leg up on other people in terms of level of experience and understanding, and just really hitting the ground running when you do finally transition into your first full-time job. So after that, I applied to USC because they had a medical device program and I got in, and then also started working full-time at Medtronic Neurovascular. So had one job interview, and luckily was able to get that out here, and I started in manufacturing. And so now I'll kind of get into some of the background and the nitty-gritty of some of the stuff that I've done, at least working. And maybe I should back up for just a second to give you guys a synopsis of what internships and co-ops might feel like or look like, because I think it's an important thing to understand when you're still not in college yet. You might not know anybody that's had an internship. So I'm going to back up a slide here. Not all internships are created equal. There's obviously, the market is pretty competitive, especially if you go to a high caliber school for biomedical engineering. But when you do have those opportunities, you should take them. And you may not necessarily be doing glorified work as a co-op or an engineer, but it really still builds the foundation. And so you may not feel like it's, a huge growth opportunity, but I think just being around individuals who are executing engineering or doing product development or even just manufacturing and quality, you start to absorb the nuances that come with being in the medical device space, because it really is a very detailed, and biotech as well, it really is a very detailed type of work. It's fast paced, but the level of concentration in terms of what you need to produce is high, and it demands a high requirement in terms of quality. So just being in that environment alone is a huge benefit. And so you can expect in most internships and co-ops to be, doing work that might not necessarily be glorious, but it is truly important, and it also will help you in your long-term career. So Medtronic Neurovascular, moved out to Southern California. That was back in 2014, I believe. So it's been 6 years since I've been out here, 7 years. So let me go into a little bit about my job before coming to Edwards. I actually was working at Medtronic Neurovascular, which at the time was under a different company's name, but I took an opportunity as a quality engineer. And if you had told me, coming out of school that I would have been working in quality or even in manufacturing, I probably, wouldn't have thought of that. So it was an interesting shift for me, but I do think that, when life kind of gives you a twist, you can take it and roll with the punches and learn quite a bit and use that to your advantage. So what I will say is I was on the opposite end of, R&D and early stage development. So that means products were developed, they were being manufactured, and essentially it was my responsibility to make sure that every single product that went out the door met the standard and quality inspection that was intended for patients. And when you're dealing with class 3 implantable neurovascular devices or any other class 3 device, which means that it is, it could, if it malfunctioned, the patient could essentially pass away. So you want to make sure, obviously, that the quality is at the highest level. So that type of environment was very fast-paced. And I'll say, being on the the tail end of manufacturing, it you know, you don't necessarily have a lot of leeway in terms of updating processes and designs, but it is a very good learning experience in the sense that you get to see the full spectrum of, you know, quality systems and the full spectrum of the engineering process. So that's what I'll say about that. And just some of the products, just to give you guys some background, we're talking microscopic parts and pieces. So these pictures on the screen, you know, they look pretty big. However, the item on the right-hand side, you actually can barely see that with the naked eye. So all the work is done under microscopes in laboratories and in clean rooms where we have to essentially gown up, put on suits, wash your hands, wear face masks, and obviously wear gloves in order to handle any sort of products. Also, if anybody has any questions, feel free to stop me at any point if you find it interesting or want to learn a little bit more. So about moving into my current job, this is a little bit of you know, preface to where I'm at now, but essentially, like I said, in most cases, you know, although an opportunity might not appear on the surface to be something that is beneficial, if it's generally moving you in the right direction and you have a goal in mind, you can leverage the skills that you learn along the way. And so that's basically what I did. And I used the manufacturing skills to move into an earlier stage manufacturing job where I was doing process development instead of process control. And what that basically means is I was working with earlier stage R&D teams, defining what they wanted out of the manufacturing, and then kind of partnering with them hand in hand. And so then again, using that skill set from the last 2 years at Edwards, 8 months ago, I switched into a very, very early stage R&D position where basically it's what you call, you know, a blue sky concept team, where basically we were handed desired outputs that the physicians would like to have in the device and the clinical outcomes that we would like to have. And then basically, for me, I work with a core team of engineers, and we try to come up with new products that meet those design requirements. So these slides are a little bit light, but I will try to talk through, to the best of my abilities, you know, what I do now, and, you know, what I really like about what I do, and what the products that we create and serve for people do to help improve patients. And so Edwards Lifesciences is, I believe, one of the largest, if not the largest, public company in Orange County. We service people who have structural heart disease. And what that means is anything that has to do with the core heart functionality. So, you know, the mechanics of your heart valves, we focus on that and try to provide therapies that help to improve patients and the diseases that patients have. So if you think of heart failure, leaky heart valves, surgical heart repair, essentially where people are cracking their chest open, that's what Edwards does. And so a very, very well-known valve through Edwards is the transcatheter heart valve. And that essentially, just over 10 years ago, really changed the entire game of heart therapy. And the reason is because physicians, to treat patients, no longer had to actually cut patients' chests open. Essentially, they were able to put an entire heart valve inside of a catheter and then actually traverse up somebody's leg up into the heart. So by accessing the larger veins in the leg, you could then deploy a whole valve and replace somebody's entire heart valve. Unfortunately, I don't have any cool graphics to show you guys. It's not really my style not to have cool pictures, but I'm pinch hitting here on this presentation. So next time I'll have some slides for you guys if you ever see me present again. But a little bit about my job now. So I mentioned, you know, I was working in pilot manufacturing, and what that meant was partnering with early stage R&D. And now I'm in what I call the blue sky concept. And so that seems ambiguous, and in some ways it can be ambiguous when essentially we pull all of our design intention from what physicians and patients either see or have. And so what I mean by that is the academic and clinical experts are really the doctors, and those people are, from lack of a better term, the gurus of the industry. And so they present at many different conferences on their findings, and they do studies on patients that have heart failure and other diseases, and then they report that back to Edwards, and Edwards gathers all that data, and then they come to us on the engineering side and say, here's a goal that we have to meet the physician's needs and the patient's needs. We need you to start developing those products. And so the product that I currently am working on and moving towards a commercially viable product, it has to do with heart repair. And so rather than implanting a full valve into somebody's heart, what we're going to go ahead and do is actually grab the leaflets. So if you imagine a heart, it's got multiple leaflets that beat up and down while the blood's actually flowing. And sometimes those leaflets can actually begin to separate or flip back over themselves and actually allow the blood to go in the wrong direction. And so a lot of findings, which are coming from these physicians and clinical data, are showing that this really is very detrimental to people's well-being. And so as you start to get into your 50s, 60s, and 70s, if you have what's called regurgitation, or the blood is flowing backwards, you will have a decrease in your lifespan. And there are lots of other detrimental things that happen from having this diseased heart. So we take that information and we try to synthesize it into a design. And so from my standpoint, I work with a team of 5 other engineers, and we have one manager and then a manager above us who oversees a larger program. There are 2 aspects to how you design the device. One is the implant itself. So that's the part that gets left behind in the patient. And then the other aspect is the delivery system. So how are we actually going to get that implant through the leg area that I mentioned, up through the body, and then to the location in the heart that the physician wants to implant it. And so my team is focused just on the implant because there are typically a lot more restrictions and tests that need to be run on something that's going to be left inside of somebody for 20 to 30 years. So once we get those criteria, we start designing. Once we get designs, that's the manufacturing and prototyping aspect. So you guys can see on the slide, I wrote manufacturing, and there should be a couple more bullet points here, but really it's get the input, create a design, test the design. So it's an iterative loop in terms of how we go about doing this, but the fundamental loop is design, build, test, design, build, test, design, build, test. And the faster you can replicate that loop, the better your shots on goal will become. And so you'll hear quite a bit as you guys move into your next stage of your lives and career. If you do continue as an engineer, fail fast is something that people really like to say. And really what that means is the quicker you can iterate, or the quicker you can run through samples and iterations, the better off you're going to be. And so I want to circle back here for a second to what my math teacher told me as I was graduating from high school. She said, you should probably think of a different career. And when I reflect on that and think about what I do today, my career isn't math intensive. There are people who in the biomedical engineering space do have very math intensive aspects. And typically those people on the R&D front are those focusing on model development and really, intensive calculation-based models that typically are used. We use them, but they're used to generate more effective fatigue analysis. So if you want the model to be accurate and predict how durable it's going to be for those 30 years, that's where you focus. And so what I want to emphasize is, yes, I did make it through all the math classes throughout high school and throughout, college. And did I pass with flying colors through calculus 3 and differential equations? No, not exactly. But it was the persistence that I think I want to emphasize to you guys that I find really important and really a really good characteristic for people that I even work with today. And so that's just kind of a sidebar here. I'll go into a little bit more detail about some of the other aspects of what I do here in a second, but that core engineering focus, on a day-to-day basis, I'm not typically, writing equations down and running calculations. My focus has actually translated into, creating new designs, running some calculations, kind of back of the napkin sketch, and then relying on computational methods and people who perform these computations to assess these designs, and using computers and leveraging software that exists to assess those models. So just wanted to make that kind of side note. I think, if I had decided to give up right then and not be an engineer because of what my high school math teacher said, my life would be completely different. So on that, after that side note, let's talk a little bit about some of the other aspects. So early stage R&D, it's, like I said, it's really dynamic. So I've talked about a couple of pillars so far. You've got your marketing and physician input, you've got your design and development, and then the other aspects are what comes after that. So typically, you go through a design process, and then within a year to 2 years, you are performing early human feasibility. So that basically means you've performed studies using animal testing, which typically can be any number of animal models, but they are living, and typically we will do an implantation on them and perform all the assessments, then do early human use, and those patients are typically very sick. So they're desperately in need of the therapies that we provide. And then we actually will go to the cases and sit with the physician and proctor the case. And what that means is we are right in there explaining to the physician how to use the device. Obviously, we do that pre-surgery, but we're there just to make sure that nothing slips up, and we are giving them guidance on how to use things, whether or not what they're seeing on the images looks to be effective and that the therapy is working. And then following that, we help after the early human use to actually get the device out into the commercial setting. And so what that means is the initial 100 to 200 cases that are commercially launched, there will most likely be both a clinical specialist there who is in there and knows the physician really well, but there will also be an R&D engineer there to make sure that there's no hiccups that happen with the devices. So that aspect is really pretty interesting in the sense that, we also need to understand the clinical impact of the device. So in one sense, I do have a strong mechanical background, and it's a continuous spectrum of learning, but I am also very experienced in the clinical side and the anatomical heart structure side. So, the right and left sides of the heart need to kind of be second nature when you are having to interface with people who are physicians and heart doctors and cardiologists who have been training for 20 plus years and need to understand and need to rely on engineers who are developing the products to know, how it's going to navigate in the heart, where it's going to be applied in the heart, what the different tissues and the structures are in the heart. And so that's a really, really interesting and fascinating piece. And so my team actually, we certainly are not the only clinical folks here at Edwards. And what I mean by that is there are hundreds of people in what's called the clinical affairs group. And what they do ranges a pretty broad spectrum, but with the people that we interface with, the clinical specialists, they actually will give feedback from the cases that they go to us, and also gather data from numerous cases so that we can make educated decisions on where these devices need to be heading, and how we need to be redesigning or tweaking some of the features based on the case inputs. So that's a really thorough description, a lot of discussion just about it. Is there any questions that you guys have specifically about what I do, or anything that you guys would be interested to know about my day-to-day basis?
I have a question.
Sure.
So what manufacturing machines do you work with on a daily, I guess?
Sure. So if you can imagine, the parts and pieces need to be very, very small. The neurovascular space was probably half the size, but the devices are more simple. In this case, we are probably a magnitude of 10x larger in some cases, but we are still using a lot of the same equipment. So laser cutting and lasers are extremely important in the medical device space. We pretty much manufacture all parts using the smallest possible equipment that you can think of. So cutting metallic sheets with lasers to create patterns, and then reforming those shapes in the way that we have designed and imagined them. So if you can cut either a tube or a sheet and then reshape it, or a wire, that's how we kind of begin our ideation process, and we have to kind of stem from there. Outside of that, we also perform micro machining. So there's a lot of processes where typical machine shops or people who make parts aren't able to do that with a standard mill. And so there's specialty machines that are actually used a lot of times by Swiss watchmakers to make very, very, very tiny parts. And those are leveraged for our space because they are able to machine very, very fine features, which you need a microscope basically to see any of the features that we typically design. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. And do you use a CO2 laser or like a fiber laser?
So we actually, fiber is a preferred method, but there's actually a level above that which is used for ablation processes. So the terminology for that would be a femto laser or an ultra short pulse width, and so that in particular has some benefits when it comes to laser cutting, because the material is essentially vaporized, and so what we can do there is actually make surface cuts as well as very clean edges when it comes to the perforations and the laser cutting itself.
Definitely. Awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, Eric. It's Nadine from Chalk. I'm thinking that you probably studied under Ellis Meng and Jerry Loeb over at USC.
Yes. So I was in the medical device and diagnostics program, but I will say I was probably 60-40 off campus, on campus, maybe even a little bit less, maybe like 70-30, because I was working at Medtronic full time at the same time.
Wonderful. I'm curious what kind of books you're reading now, and sort of what activities did you love most about your engineering education? Was it the hands-on stuff, or did you love reading sort of the big textbooks?
It's a good question. I'm going to think about that for a second. I think it always depended on the subject. So, you're not going to be, I'm just going to say this is the same with work as well. you're not going to be interested in everything that you work on. That's something that I think people have a bit of a misnomer about, that, you know, people say, you should love your job, you should love your work, you should love your school. That doesn't mean necessarily, I mean, some people are blessed and every single aspect of what they do is fulfilling and really a lot of fun. But there's hard work in between the lines, I think, where people, you might not necessarily be totally interested in every aspect. So I think I personally was more into the hands-on aspect of working in the lab, getting my hands a little bit dirty, and you know, really seeing things come to fruition from either testing or design and experimentation. So needless to say, you know, there are some aspects I was really interested in material science, and I loved reading material science books. And you know, I'm still fascinated about materials engineering. But if you had asked me to probably read my, you know, differential equations textbook, I wouldn't have been too thrilled about it. But you know, there are lots and lots of sources for data now for those who are interested in seeing hands-on aspects, or even just, you know, being more academic about their reading. Today, I would say, you know, obviously we live in a really vast amount of data that comes out nowadays due to the internet and just the ability to store information. And you know, it's hard to even keep up from a biomedical aspect with how much, I mean, just look at COVID, right? So there's so much data coming in about patients that it's almost impossible for us to really keep up. They're doing a pretty good job with how much information there is. And so where I'm going with this is, if you subscribe or if you do get interested in anything you're passionate about from a biomedical sense, it's really easy to find that information online, and to even just get news articles. And one way that I frequently read about, you know, things both on the industry side as well as the academic side is to just subscribe to some newsletters. So MDDI online is one that focuses on medical device. I also typically try to, like on my Google news feed, I'll select life sciences. And so I get quite a few updates about, you know, new therapies that are coming out, as well as findings within my own space. So within heart repair, I'll get updates and targeted, you know, news findings about therapies that we're either doing or in direct competition with. So hopefully that helps. I don't know if that answered your question totally.
That was excellent. Thank you.
Okay, let's see.
Questions?
It's 4 o'clock on Friday. I know you guys are probably itching to get out of there. Honestly, feel free to ask me anything. If you guys want to ask about my, you know, path to where I got to, or what I think about other majors or other areas of work, or if you guys have any other questions about what I do specifically on like a day-to-day basis, I'd be happy to answer that kind of stuff too.
So in terms of your prototyping in such a professional industry, what would some of your stages kind of look like? Like just like quick, like the steps and stages in something for Edwards prototyping.
Okay, yeah, that's good. So I would say all the people on my team, well, sorry, the designers on my team, including myself, it's a must that you are proficient in CAD, or computer animated design. So there's a couple of software packages that people will be taught as they go through college. So if you're basically in any engineering discipline, I'm pretty sure you will have a CAD class. And so there's lots of different flavors of that. Probably the most common and the one that we use the most is called SolidWorks. And so it really starts there. That's where, you know, you'll come up with a sketch. You take a look at a whiteboard and you sit down and say, okay, we have a concept here. or I should say we have a user need or a patient need, and we want to design a physical device that targets something. We think, okay, if I do this, the valve is going to do this, or if I create this kind of a shape, we're going to be able to do this or this interaction. And so that's really where it starts. And so we actually do really, I mean, we use whiteboard sketches a lot, and we'll take pictures and send in images of whiteboards for patent applications. And so there really is some truth to that in just sketching something up. From there, we'll create a design, which is done on the CAD programs. And so you'll be able to really kind of bring it to life in the sense that you're creating physical, tangible, viewable objects, and you can see how those objects actually, mate and fit together with one another, and how they're actually going to look in the anatomy. And so you can manipulate things in a geometric sense on your computer screen. From there, you typically will need to also consider how the part's going to be made. And so, the further you get into engineering, the more you start to realize how stuff is made. And so I'll use an example here. I've got, a screw on my desk here. So this is just a nut and a bolt. And so to get to this, the designer had to realize, okay, I actually start with a rod of metal, and then I need to make all these cuts into it. And so from our standpoint, you may have a geometry that you're envisioning, but then you have to distill it back down into, okay, am I going to make this from a tube or a sheet or a wire, or am I going to cut it from a rod, or am I going to cut it from a piece of stock material? And so I think that's one of the things that kind of my eyes were opened up to the further into engineering I got, because you don't necessarily think about how all this stuff is made as you go through life growing up. You don't think, oops, good, okay. You don't think, my AirPods case, they had to shoot and inject plastic to make this. You have a big cavity. And so from that aspect, that's kind of the next phase after you come up with the design, or you kind of bake that into your design process. And then you need to send that simplified model to whoever is going to be making it. So then you send that to them, they make it, and then you do the post-processing on that with technicians, and then you try to attempt to assemble that, okay? And so that begins the cycle that I talked about, which is design, build, test, design, build, test. And testing can take any number of forms, but typically you have something in mind that you're going to test as you're creating a design. And it can be as simple as just, is this gonna open? Is the device gonna, am I gonna be able to hook it up to another device the way that I'm intending to do it? It could be as simple as that, but it can also be, as complicated as, am I gonna be able to determine whether or not the therapy is effective with a benchtop model? So in that regard, that design, build, test, it can get as complicated as you want it to be, but that's typically the next stage. And so once you've done enough benchtop testing, then the next phase is really getting into more realistic testing. And that's when, the really kind of scatterbrained prototyping starts to kind of fall away, and you really start to hone in on a couple designs, and you start to iterate. And that's when things really kind of pick up speed in terms of how quickly you can move into effective therapy. It's not necessarily, you don't need to be as creative and come up with 100 different designs on how to get to a certain place, but that's when you're starting to make fine-tuned tweaks, when you're starting to look at anatomical models like we'll use a lot of tissue. So we'll use pig hearts or sheep hearts or anything like that to actually test and do demos on with products. And so that's where, you know, the prototyping moves into refinement, and following that is when you really start to move into the commercialization phases, and your tweaks are much less aggressive, and you're making, you know, one component here, one dimension here, and then, you know, making sure that everything you determined in the earlier stages of prototyping is real and accurate.
Definitely. Thank you. And then I guess my quick follow-up to that is, when you have that kind of final iterated prototype, how do you certify that it's like safe, I guess? Like, at such a small scale level, like how do you ensure like safety requirements with something like that?
Sure. So there are lots of phases to this, and the FDA and regulatory bodies in Europe are the primary groups that we work with. So there are other entities that also exist. So obviously you have other continents like Asia as well as Africa and Australia who also have a say in it. But initially we start with the regulations that are dictated by the FDA as well as the EU. And so from there are laws and regulations that say this type of testing proves statistical significance that your device is safe and effective. And so when I'm going to take a presentation off just for a second, just so you guys can see me. Basically, the way in which we certify with a low level of devices is to use statistical samples. And so you have to meet a minimum criteria, and that's actually fleshed out in clinical trials. So the stages that I talked about, typically you'll start with animal studies, well, benchtop first, then you move your way up into animal studies, then you move to the next level, which is early human use. And so that's a limited number of devices, and it's typically, a lot of times it can be done in Europe, or it can also be done here in the US. And those patients are very sick, but you get an initial set of data, and then the clinical trial is really where a bulk of your data set is found. And so that count can be anywhere from 2 to 600 patients. Okay, and so every single one of those patients is vitally important to determining the effectiveness of the therapy. And so when you look at the numbers, and this is a big part of the medical and biotech space, statistics are of the utmost importance. And so you'll basically learn right away as you get into the industry, everyone relies on statistical analysis very, very heavily. And so if you look at the trends of what we determine for a success in a clinical trial, anywhere from 2 to 600 patients typically is enough for us to determine that the therapy is going to be effective. So hopefully that answers your question. It seems like a small sample, but the amount of tests that go into the device prior to that, it's kind of mind-boggling, to be honest. And that's why a typical life cycle for any device that's a class 3 device can be from 2 to 10 years. It really just depends on how much data has been built up as a predicate and how much data there is prior to your device being implemented into the commercial setting.
Definitely. No, that answers a lot. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Rachel, any more additional questions before we wrap up? I'd like to finish early.
Oh, sure. No problem.
Maybe one thing you can share, because we'd like insiders' view about what it's like to work at Edwards. I mean, you guys are your own little city over there and continuing to expand. And what kind of employee perks
do you
have at Edwards? Why work at Edwards?
For sure. So that's a good transition. So I would say this is just a couple shots of my life outside of work. And I think one thing that's great about Edwards is it's a culture of people who are really passionate about what they're doing, and people who are independent enough because they have the passion to focus on this, that people are given flexibility, and it's really an empowering place to work. So some of the things at Edwards that are cool and interesting and a lot of fun, we have a big cafeteria that basically, we have subsidized food here. It's not free like Google and the stuff in the Bay, but it is very affordable, and it's a fantastic place to eat, and you have your pick from 10 to 20 different selections every single day. So it's not like you're getting in a cafeteria line or anything like that. Another interesting thing is it's actually a campus here, and so I've heard a lot of people when they first come say it's actually like a college, in the sense that we actually have a quad or a center area where people will, it's funny, after work people will play ultimate frisbee, people will play soccer. I've seen a couple people try to start flag football leagues. We also have a full-size basketball court, a sand volleyball court, a full gym here, and a couple people last year tried to ask our CEO in the all-company meeting for a swimming pool, but that didn't go over that well. So maybe a couple years from now. But yeah, it really is. It's a really nice, fantastic place to work. I've been to, like I said, I co-opted GE Aviation. I co-opted Johnson & Johnson. I worked at Medtronic, and I can say hands down that this is the best place that I have worked so far in my short time in the 10 years in the field. And people really love it here, and there's a reason for that, and I'm not just saying that. And so if you get an opportunity to stop on the campus and check it out, I highly recommend it. And if you look up Edwards Lifesciences, you'll really see this company believes in innovating, and we do actually try to come up with doing innovative products despite being a multi-billion-dollar company. We're not just sitting on our haunches and making money off of old products. We really do want to help improve and change the way that therapy is done. So that's just a little bit about Edwards, and it's a really exciting place to work. So I hope you guys all get a chance to see it someday if you ever are interested. And whenever we're past COVID, I'm sure they'll start to show people.